In this lecture, we're going to have a look at judgment, making decisions, biases, and how we as teachers can deal with bias. So let's start with talking about confirmation bias. So what is confirmation bias? And the illustration here on the slide shows us that reasonably well. So confirmation bias is when you don't look at everything, you only look at what confirms, what of the facts confirm what you already believe. It's a very common bias, and I'm sure each and every one of us can identify times when it has impacted on us. Now, the problem with confirmation bias is, of course, that it's simply how common it is and how difficult it is to, when you are experiencing it yourself, to know that is what you're experiencing. Now, hindsight bias is a little different to confirmation bias, and as you can see, it occurs after an event. The big challenge with hindsight bias is that if it stops you learning from your mistakes, that means you're going to ignore opportunities to improve your judgment and your capacity and your awareness of what bias, how bias might be affecting you. If we look at another couple of biases, so anchoring bias, as it says there, it's a flawed heuristic where a given value skews your own estimation of what's going on. So, and what that means is that your thinking is anchored, and it's anchored in a flawed space. There are real-world effects of anchor bias in things like automobile sales or real estate sales. The first item you're shown is your anchor, and you compare everything you see thereafter to that anchor. Now, real estate agents actually use this, they exploit this, they deliberately show you something so that everything you're comparing, looking at after that is compared to that first thing. And that first thing is probably either the worst or the best of everything they're going to show you, depending on what they're trying to achieve. Now, if we look at representativeness bias, that's where we simplify our social judgments, and we say that every person or every object that fits into this category has all of the features of that category. Now, that's very convenient for us, but this is fallacious. People and objects and events are not always able to be categorized. It is not true necessarily true that eating fatty foods makes you fat. If you are a person with cystic fibrosis, you need to eat fatty foods because you can't absorb fat properly, which means that you are at risk of not having adequate levels of fat-soluble vitamins, and it's actually very difficult for you to put on weight. But people will criticise you because you're eating fatty food. Ulcers are due to stress. Now, we actually now know that ulcers are due to a bacterial infection, and it has nothing to do with stress. Let's move on to our next type of bias, which is availability bias. And again, it's a fantastic illustration here on the slide of when we think about information that is available to us versus how much information there really is. And of course, what I would add to that is, apart from what's covered in the news, is what is turning up in the algorithms of our social media. That's been a big challenge in the last couple of weeks in Australia, hasn't it? But if we look at availability biases, it means that when we're making judgments about how probable something is, we're wrong. because we're almost definitely overestimating the frequency with which something will happen. So if we see images of a plane crash, we're going to presume that plane crashes are very common. Any of us who saw the movie Jaws as young children are going to have a view that shark attacks happen far too often and that the sea is a very dangerous place and we should never swim in it. Whereas we're actually much more likely to be killed by having a drink vending machine fall on us than we are by a shark. But you don't see us avoiding drink vending machines. Tyranny of choice is another bias that impacts on our decision making, and that's simply that if there are too many choices, where some people are just going to give up on making decisions at all. Now, in terms of judgment and decision making, we need to think about, as educators, we need to think about how we teach about bias and what sort of thinking skills we're teaching. There are a number of critical thinking skills. So critical thinking, the first part of it is where we identify a problem and we select a strategy, and then we will apply common algorithms and heuristic strategies to try and solve the problem. But if we move on to more advanced critical thinking, then we're going to understand the various biases that exist and we're going to work to overcome them. So what I have provided for you here on this slide is some resources for you to explore around critical thinking skills. If you would like to do that, the Wabi Sabi learning blogs are very interesting. Lee Watanabe Crockett is a fantastic educational philosopher, and I would encourage you to read his work. The other thing to think about with critical thinking skills around decision making is to think about Bloom's taxonomy. So what level of Bloom's taxonomy are we in when we're using critical thinking skills? And how do we get our students there to those levels on Bloom's taxonomy? So this is a task that we'll be doing in class. We'll be working in groups in our breakout rooms, and this is a table that I'll be getting you to fill out in your breakout rooms.